Good evening. It's good to see everybody here tonight. Tonight, I want to talk a little bit about our circle of concern and our circle of influence here within the church. Now, a few weeks back, we went through and we kind of discussed a little bit about our perception on how things are presented to us. We see things the way that they are. We'll see an old lady over here versus a young lady, but the same picture can be viewed both ways depending on which way you look at it. Just as Paul the Apostle had gone through and worked with the Jews, he had talked about how he discussed one way, but all the Jews came around and they actually caused problems for Paul the Apostle as a result of it. Now, an excellent way to become more self-aware regarding our own degree of proactivity is to look where we focus our time and our energy. We each have a wide range of concerns here in life. Our health, our children, our problems at work, national debt, nuclear war, you name it, the list goes on and on and on for these issues. Now we could separate these things in which we have no particular mental or emotional involvement by creating what is called a circle of concern, which is our circle of concern. As we look at those things within our circle of concern, it becomes more apparent that there are some things over which we have no real control, and others are something that we can actually do about. We can identify those concerns in the latter group by circumscribing them in the smaller circle, which is called our influence, the things that we can control as a result of it. By determining which of these two circles is the focus most of our time and energy, we can discover much about the degree of our proactivity as a result of it. So proactive people focus their efforts on the circle of influence. They work on things that they do something about, or they can do something about. The nature of their energy is typically very positive. It's enlarging, it's magnifying, and causing their circle of influences to actually increase as a result of it. Reactive people, on the other hand, focus their efforts on their circle of concern. They focus on the weakness of other people, the problems in the environment, and the circumstances over which they have no control over the situation. Their focus results in a lot of blaming and accusing type of attitudes, very reactive and harsh type languages, and increased feelings of victimization. The negative energy generated by that focus, combined with neglect in areas they could actually do something about, cause their circle of influence to actually shrink because of it. So that's the reactive. So go to the next one. As long as we're working in our circle of concern, we empower the things within it to control us. We aren't talking about the proactive initiative necessary to affect the positive change. Now let's go over some examples here of the circles of concern. So some of our circles of concern when we go through and we talk about Christ is the lack of knowledge that we may have about speaking about the Lord. Not feeling confident enough to get up here and actually preach and teach and be able to spread the gospel. And not feeling comfortable to be able to go out into the public and talk to somebody at the grocery store when you have a few minutes and you talk to somebody behind you about the Lord or the gospel or something in the Bible or maybe even a topic that you might overhear just in public conversation. These are things in our circle of concern. As long as we focus on our shortcomings, we accomplish nothing except increasing our own feelings of inadequacy and helplessness to reinforce our lack of confidence. It's only when we work in our circle of influence, which is when we focused on ourselves, that we begin to create that positive type energy that will change ourselves and our outlook as we go through Christ. By working on ourselves, instead of worrying about conditions being just right, or somebody else bringing up the conversation about God or a specific event such as baptism. And with this knowledge, we can influence the conditions. We have that confidence to be able to go and speak about it and actually bring up the topics rather than them being brought up and then we just kind of interject a concern or a topic or a solution as a result of it. So keep going. Sorry. One more? Keep going. So, perfect example. We have Billy Bob here, and then we have, go one more. we have Stan the man. So Billy Bob, he goes through and he actually studies. He took the proactive approach to go through and to learn the gospel. And he did what is right by learning and becoming confident in what needs to be preached. He was ready to rock and roll, so to speak. However, Stan the man over here, when asked about the Bible, he was a little bit nervous. He couldn't really answer the questions, and he's backed into a corner, and he's not confident when he discusses the Lord. Especially when the Mormons come up and they bring their Watchtower Bible, and they start talking about it. You know, some people here, they're going to get really nervous, and they're just going to cower down and say, okay, whatever you say. And they're not going to be able to have that confidence to stand up for the Lord. Keep going. Next slide. However, there's a third type of person that becomes very selfish and very overconfident. Because of this position, such as wealth, role, or relationship, there are some circumstances in which a person's circle of influence is larger than his or her concern. This situation reflects on a self-emotional myopia. And I'm going to use that word as a myopia because whenever you go to the eye doctor, my daughter just went here, that is a condition of short-sightedness, where you can only see just what's in front of you and not far, far away. So you often hear about this, like I said, when you go to the doctor, but it's also a lack of imagination, a foresight, or even intellectual insight. Of course, that's what the Webster Dictionary defined myopia as, the additional pieces, which I thought was very apropos to this conversation right here. So they may not have to prioritize to use their influence, but proactive people have a circle of concern that's at least as big as their circle of influence, accepting the responsibility to use their influence effectively. It's very important to think about that. Now, what are some of the controls that we have as a result of this? We have, as you know, direct control, indirect control, and obviously the last one that everybody loves, no control at all, right? So the problems we face in one of these areas is direct control. Problems involving our own behavior. Indirect control, problems involving other people's behavior. And no control, problems we can't do anything about, such as our past or even situational realities. The proactive approach puts the first step in the solution of all three kinds of problems within the present circle of this type of influence. So, direct control. Problems are solved by working on our habits. Why, you may ask? Because they're in our circle of influence. It's something that we can control. Indirect control. Our problems are solved by changing our methods of influence. Most people have about 3 to 4 different types of these methods that they use, and they usually start with reasoning. If this doesn't work, then they start fighting. Then if this doesn't work, then ultimately it goes to the flight mentality. Think of that in any type of situation, whether it's a friend, a coworker, somebody you meet, out there on the street, and you start talking with them. First thing you do is you start reasoning with them. Hey, come to church. You need to be baptized to be saved. Usually escalates a little bit more. It goes to the fighting stage. You might argue about it. You might say, you need to be saved. You need to be baptized. I'm saved. Jesus God and I have a special spot together. We know each other, And then ultimately, like I say, it goes to the flight. We agree to disagree, and you go your own separate direction as a result of it. So think of these situations in your life where people resort to these 3 types of controls in this situation. You begin to speak with others about the Bible. Usually come off nice, very friendly, and want to tell how they got saved, right? Have Jesus in their heart, or even some other excuse about them, and God having an understanding. As the conversation goes on, people resort to 2 or 3 on the list, like I said. How often in your own experience have you experienced this type of control? Now, the last one on the list, obviously, is no control. This is something that everyone fears about. Now, who here likes to be out of control? Anybody like to be out of control? No? You like to control your own destiny? All right. So we like to be in control when we drive down the road. We like to have control of our checking accounts, and we like to have control of our decisions in life. But no control problems involve taking the responsibility to change the line on the bottom of our face to a smile, perhaps, to genuinely and peacefully accept these problems and learn to live with them, even though we don't like them. In this way, we do not empower these problems to control us. Go to the next slide. Whether a problem is direct, indirect, or no control at all, we have in our hands the first step to the solution. Changing our habits, changing our methods of influence, and changing the way we see no control problems are all within our circle of influence. Next one. So here I've got a couple of verses that talk about our no control here. In Isaiah 41:10, which was read earlier, "So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." And in Psalm 46:1, "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble." And then in Philippians 4:6, verse 7, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Now, let's talk about the expanding circle of our influence that we have here. It's inspiring to realize that in choosing our response to circumstance, we powerfully affect our circumstance. When we change the part of our chemical formula, we change the nature of the results. Think about this for a minute. You change the chemical formula of something. Think of this as like baking, right? If you have baking cookies and you put in your cookies and they turn out flat, probably need some baking soda in there to get them to rise up a little bit. But just that little bit of altering and changing the amount of baking soda in those cookies caused them to either rise up or stay flat on the pan as a result of it. I know I've done that a couple times and had some pretty flat cookies. They still taste good though. Let me see if I can try to put this in the perspective a little bit more. If there are some people who interpret proactive to mean pushy, aggressive, insensitive, but that really isn't the case at all. Proactive people usually aren't pushy. They're smart, they're value-driven, they read reality, and they know what is needed to kind of get things done. Now, I know everybody's going to kind of roll their eyes here, but I'm going to use this as an example. How many of us have heard of Gandhi? Yeah? In the Indian culture, Gandhi, right? So while his accusers were in the legislative chambers characterizing him because he wouldn't join their circle of concern, rhetoric condemning the British Empire for the Indian people, Gandhi was actually out in the rice paddies. He was quietly and slowly expanding his circle of influence with his field laborers. A groundswell of support, of trust, of confidence followed him through the countryside. Though he held no political office or position, through compassion, courage, fasting, and moral persuasion, he eventually brought England to its knees, breaking the political domination of 300 million people with the power of his greatly expanded circle of influence as a result of it. Now, who does that remind us of? Now, think about this approach. Was this somebody that was proactive? He was characterized or criticized by others. He was out with the commoners. He quietly and slowly expanded his circle of influence. He had a groundswell of support and confidence and trust that followed him through the countryside by his disciples and his common people. If you guessed Jesus, you're probably correct. Actually, you are correct. It's amazing the lesson can be taught by his actions in the story we read in the Bible and how we can apply this to our daily influence in others. Go to the next slide. So the haves and the bees. One way to determine, keep going. One way to determine which circle of our concern is to distinguish between the haves and the bees is the circle of concern filled with the haves. Now, we've heard of the haves, I've got something, right? I'll be happy when I have my house paid off. If only I had a boss who wasn't such a dictator. If only I had more patient husband. If I had more obedient kids. If I had my college degree. If I could just have more time to myself, all my problems would be fixed, right? However, if you look at it from a different perspective, there's a circle of influence that's called the B's. I can be more patient. I can be wise. I can be loving. It's that type of character focus that's very important to us. So anytime we think the problem is actually out there, that thought is actually the problem. We empower what's out there to control us. The change in paradigm is outside in. What's out there has to change before we can change, which is very interesting. The proactive approach is the change from the inside out. Be different, and by being different, to effect positive change in what's out there. I can be more resourceful. I can be more diligent. I can be more creative. And I can even be more cooperative as a result. I read and study the Bible to be more prepared. I can practice speaking with others about Christ. And I can be anything within the church here to be able to represent, being able to preaching, standing up on the table, being able to lead prayer. I can do anything to be prepared and have that proactive type of focus there. Now, I've got an interesting story to kind of tie this together a little bit, and it was in the Old Testament. Who here has heard of the story of Joseph? Yeah, you probably heard it a couple times. But I want to read this to you, and now that I've got this understanding and foundation from behind the scenes, I want you to read the story and think about that perspective on the previous information that I've given you tonight. In the story of Joseph, he was sold into slavery by his brothers. Go to the next slide. At the age of 17. You can imagine how easy it would have been for him to languish in self-pity as a servant to Potiphar, to focus the weakness of his brothers and his captors on all that he didn't have. But Joseph was proactive. He worked on the B portion of things. And within a short period of time, he was running Potiphar's household. He was in charge of all that Potiphar had because the trust was so high. Then that day came to Joseph. Then that day when Joseph was caught in a difficult situation, he refused to compromise his integrity. As a result, he was unjustly imprisoned for 13 years. But again, he was proactive. He worked on the inner circle of being instead of having. And soon he was running the prison and eventually the entire nation of Egypt, second only behind Pharaoh. Now I know this idea is a dramatic paradigm shift for many people as a result of it. It is so much easier to blame other people, conditioning or conditions for their own stagnant situation. But we're responsible, think of that word, responsible, to control our lives, to powerfully influence our circumstances by working on the be and what we are. Now, if I have a problem in my marriage, what do I really gain by confessing my wife's sins? But am I really responsible? I'm saying I'm not responsible. I make myself basically a powerless victim as a result of it. I immobilize myself in a negative type of situation. I also diminish my ability to influence her. My nagging, my accusations, my critical attitude only makes her feel validated in her own weakness as a result of it. You see how this kind of compounds the effect there? My criticism is worse than the conduct I want to try to correct in the relationship. My ability to positively impact the situation basically withers and dies as a result of it. If I really want to improve my situation, I can work on the one thing which I have control over, which is myself. I can stop trying to shape up my wife, like the classic term shape up or ship out kind of thing, and work on my own weaknesses. I can focus on being a great marriage partner, a source of unconditional love and support. Hopefully, my wife will feel the power of proactive example and respond in kind as a result of it. But whether she does or doesn't, the most positive way that I can influence my situation is to work on myself and my being. Oops. Oop, go back. Sorry. There are so many ways to work in the circle of influence. To be a better listener, to be a more loving marriage partner, to be a better student, to be more cooperative and a dedicated employee. Sometimes the most proactive thing we can do is just be happy. Just genuinely smile at people. Happiness, unlike unhappiness, is a proactive choice. Just like us coming to church is a proactive choice. Things that we have in control to do. These things like the weather that our circle of influence will never include, but as proactive people, we can carry our own physical or social weather with us. We can be happy and accept those things that at present we can't control, while we focus on efforts on the things that we actually can control. Now, we may be a small church here, but we continue to grow our circle of influence by the means of the internet, the radio, outreach to the community, and also help spread the gospel throughout the world. Now, if you think about it, it's unimaginable how many people we have indirectly reached and touched and have actually brought to Christ throughout the world that we have never met or physically even heard of. Think about the people in the Philippines and the people on the radio program that listen to us, and even the internet here when they go on there and watch it. It's very important to think about that. Now, the other end of the stick. Before we totally shift our life focus, before we totally shift our focus to our circle of influence, we need to consider two things in our circle of concern to merit this type of deeper thought, which are consequences and mistakes. While we're free to choose our own actions, we are not free to choose the consequences on those actions. Consequences are governed, obviously, by the natural law. They are out in the circle of concern. We can decide to step in front of a fast-moving train, but we cannot decide what will happen when the train actually hits us. That's the natural state of law. We can decide to be dishonest in our business dealings. While the social consequences of that decision may vary depending on whether or not we're actually found out, the natural consequences to our basic character are a fixed result. Our behavior is governed by these principles. Living in harmony with them brings positive consequences. Violating them brings negative consequences. We are free to choose our response in any situation, but in doing so, we choose the attendant consequence. When we pick up the end of the stick, we pick up the other. Undoubtedly, there have been times in each of our lives when we have picked up what the latter felt was the wrong end of the stick. You like that term? That phrase that people use to get the wrong end of the stick? Of course, we have brought consequences we would rather not have lived without. If we had the choice to do it over again, we would make it differently. We call these choices mistakes. They happen. Think of it as sin. It happens to us sometimes daily, sometimes once a month, every now and then. It happens. For those, we call those mistakes, and they are the second thing that merits our deeper thought. For those filled with regret, perhaps, the most needful exercise of proactivity is to realize that the past mistakes are also out there in the circle of concern. We can't recall them. We can't undo them. We can't control the consequences that came as a result. Now, question. How many of us go to prayer whenever we make a mistake? Sometimes we make a mistake. Sometimes we realize it. Sometimes if it's a big mistake, we'll go to prayer immediately. Sometimes the small mistake, we just kind of throw it off to the side and say, hey, I'll deal with that later, you know? Now, the proactive approach to a mistake is to acknowledge it instantly. You have to instantly say, hey, you know what? Man, I made a mistake. We need to correct and learn from these mistakes. This literally turns a failure into a success. Now, a lot of you have heard of the guy from IBM. His name was T.J. Watson. He had a saying on here. And he said that success is on the far side of failure. Think about that. Success is on the far side of failure. It's a complete 180-degree term. But not to acknowledge a mistake and not to correct it and not learn from it is a mistake of a different order altogether. It usually puts a person on a self-deceiving, self-justifying path and often involves rationalization, or what are referred to as rational type lies, to ourselves and to others. This second mistake, this cover-up, empowers the first, giving it a disproportionate importance that cause a far deeper injury to yourself and to your type of reputation. It is not whether others do or even own up to their mistake that hurts us the most. It's our response to those things. Chasing after the poisonous snake that bites us will only drive the poison through the entire system. It's far better to take measures to immediately get the poison out than to chase after the snake, right? You know how they always say to stop what you're doing, put on a tourniquet, keep the poison from getting there. You don't want to get up and start running and go chasing after that snake because it's just going to go through your system and take you out that much quicker. Our response to any mistake affects the quality of the next moment. It's important to immediately admit and correct our mistakes so that they have no power over that next moment, and we ultimately are empowered again as a result of it. Now, making and keeping commitments. At the very heart of our circle of influence, our ability to make and meet commitments and promises. These commitments will make ourselves and others and our integrity to those commitments in the essence and clearest manifestation of our proactivity. It is also the essence of our growth. Through our human endowments and our self-awareness and conscious, we become conscious of areas of weakness, areas for improvement, areas of talent we become conscious, areas of talent that could be developed, areas that need to be changed or eliminated from our lives. Then as we recognize and use our imagination and independent will to act on awareness, making promises, setting goals, and being true to them, we build strength and character. The beginning that makes possible every other positive thing in our lives. It is here where we find two ways to put ourselves in control of our lives immediately. We can make a promise and keep it, or we can set a goal and work to achieve it. As we make and keep commitments, even small commitments, we begin to establish an inner integrity that gives us the awareness of self-control and courage and strength to accept more responsibility for our own lives. By making and keeping promises to ourselves and others, little by little, our honor becomes greater than our actual moods that we have. The power to make and keep commitments to ourselves is the essence of developing the basic habits of effectiveness. Knowledge, skill, and desire are all within our control. We can work on any one to improve the balance of the three. As the area of intersection becomes larger, we more deeply internalize the principles upon which the habits are based and create the strength of character to move us in a balanced way towards increasing effectiveness in our lives. Now, by following this advice that we previously discussed, it allows us to have the opportunity by first making a choice and moving towards Christ by studying the Bible and applying these principles we have learned in this lesson today. By working on a circle of influence, just as Christ did while he was here on the earth, we can give control to God and put our faith in him. Our circle of influence should be filled with the B's, to be able to recognize that the problem is not out there or somebody else's problem, and that change needs to happen from inside out in order to recognize, learn, and correct from our mistakes. Now, if you have had mistakes in your life and you would like to make that change from the haves to the B's and give your control to Christ by learning from his example, I urge you to take this opportunity by coming up to the front during the song as we're about to sing, by becoming baptized through the immersion of water and trusting your faith in the Lord.
Nothing less than Jesus' blood and
click on it, and then click